Well, thanks for joining us for the Q&A podcast produced by C-SPAN. I'm your host, Peter Slett. Our guest this week is historian Peniel Joseph, whose newest book is about the year 1963. That podcast begins in a moment. Peniel Joseph teaches history at the University of Texas, among other things. He holds the Barbara Jordan Chair at the LBJ School of Public Affairs there, and he's the author now of 8 books. His latest is titled Freedom Season, and it's about the year 1963 and its impact on the civil rights movement. Among other things, that remarkable year saw the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, the publication of James Baldwin's bestseller, The Fire Next Time, the March on Washington, the assassinations of Medgar Evers and John Kennedy, and the horrific bombing at the 16th Avenue Baptist Church in Birmingham, which killed 4 little girls. Peniel Joseph charts the year and argues that it was the turning point in the civil rights movement. Our conversation with Professor Joseph begins now. Peniel Joseph, in your new book, Freedom Season, you write that 1963 was a year that tried to make sense of the civil rights movement. Explain.
Well, 1963, I think, is the most pivotal year of the 1960s. It's the year that gives us both triumphs and tragedies. And it's really the year that makes the 1960s the 60s. So it's civil rights insurgency, it's the Kennedy administration going back and forth with activists like Martin Luther King Jr. and others about what to do next. We see a right-wing insurgency. George Wallace becomes one of the pivotal figures of the year. And people like William F. Buckley in the National Review are engaged in a war of ideas with people like James Baldwin, who becomes the best-selling author and really perhaps the most pivotal figure in the entire year. So it's really an extraordinary year.
Yeah, James Baldwin is a real tentpole in your book.
Baldwin is a through line because when we think about Baldwin in 1963, he becomes the most famous global public intellectual. He's not just famous in the United States. He's famous in France and in London. He goes to Istanbul. He goes to Israel. He goes all across the world. And he becomes this figure of really confrontation, reconciliation, reunion, also a brilliant critic of America, but also an aspirational critic. He dreams of this grand American republic that confronts the original sin of racial slavery and finally lives up to the precepts of citizenship and dignity for all people.
Well, the year starts off January 1st as the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. Was that celebrated? Was it a big deal?
It was a massive deal. Civil rights activists wanted it to be celebrated even more than it was. The Kennedy administration sort of slow rolls the celebration. They try to tie it into a celebration at the White House for the birthday of Abraham Lincoln in February of 1963. There's going to be over 800 Negro dignitaries, what African Americans called themselves proudly in 1963. And what's so interesting about the Kennedy administration is that 63 is what makes the Kennedy record on the civil rights movement. 63 is when that administration finally steps up to the plate. But we see people like Medgar Evers, people like Ella Baker, Gloria Richardson, Lorraine Hansberry. They're pushing both Bobby Kennedy and John F. Kennedy. And Bobby Kennedy is extraordinary because even though he's Attorney General, in 1963, he really serves as the de facto Prime Minister of the United States.
In 1963, early in the year, how would you describe the Kennedy administration when it came to civil rights?
Reluctant. The best description is reluctant. They did not want the civil rights struggle to dampen their other legislative priorities. At the start of the year, State of the Union, Jack Kennedy says his biggest priority is a tax cut. It's a tax cut, it's education. He wants to pass Medicare, and certain things that are going to become a part of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society are first introduced by Jack Kennedy and the New Frontier. So I'd say they were reluctant to become too vocal lest it mess up their legislative priorities.
King's dream was a chaotic nightmare for Jack and Bobby Kennedy, you write.
Absolutely. Birmingham is going to be a very, very interesting case study. In the spring of 1963, Birmingham is figuratively and literally on fire. There's going to be a movement to racially integrate the city. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who is really only 34 years old, but the most famous civil rights activist in the country and really the world, he helps a local movement that's led by Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth try to desegregate the city of Birmingham. Birmingham's extraordinary. It's a dying steel town. It's the citadel of the Confederacy, and it's really run by a three-person commissioner instead of mayoralship. And Eugene Bull Connor becomes the iconic segregationist in 1963. He unleashes fire hoses and German shepherds on peaceful demonstrators, and the fire hoses are powerful enough to strip the bark off of trees. The Kennedy administration is watching all of this in April and May, including Dr. King, who's imprisoned Easter Sunday of 1963, where King writes his very famous letter from Birmingham jail.
Would you say that the civil rights movement was coordinated and in sync in early 1963?
Yeah, I would say there's coordination. I'd say in a lot of ways, when we think about the different groups, the NAACP, the SCLC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, Malcolm X in the Nation of Islam, there is coordination, but there's also polarization and division and debate over what does citizenship mean, what does freedom mean, what does dignity mean. And when we think about 1963, we're going to see an evolution of the way in which these civil rights groups really are inspired by each other and are influenced by each other. Even Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, their relationship changes over 63. Malcolm is a vociferous critic of King, but even he has to acknowledge the power and the majesty of the movement for Black dignity and citizenship that the grassroots are organizing. So when he sees what's happening in Birmingham and at the March on Washington, even though he remains a critic, he wants to be a part of the movement more than ever.
Peniel Joseph, race relations, the attitude toward them in the U.S., different regionally?
It's going to be different regionally only to a certain extent. 63 is an extraordinary year. It's the first year that Newsweek uses Lewis Harris, the pollster, to do sentiment polling on Black and white Americans. They sent out over 50 pollsters all across the South, but the North, the Midwest, really over 150 pollsters, and they interview over 2,000 African Americans to see how people who are from lower social economic backgrounds, the middle class, even some who are wealthy, how do they feel about their chances and their prospects of fulfilling the American dream? And so that's the first time that happens. So Newsweek has fascinating, great material on this stuff. Newsweek also interviews whites and asks them about their racial attitudes. Would you live next door to an African American? Would you want them to be part of the family? Would you work with them? And is the civil rights movement moving too fast or slow? So for the first time, we really get, and it's really extraordinary, Peter, because people are honest about how they feel. People who feel, hey, I would work with somebody who's a Negro, but wouldn't live next door to them, they say it. There isn't really the kind of niceties that we would have in the future when people realize that civil rights or racial justice is a moral and political good.
Well, the well-known public intellectual Norman Podhoretz, in his magazine Commentary, wrote an article in February of 1963, "My Negro Problem and Yours." Quote, "I cannot restrain my nervousness when I pass a group of Negroes standing in front of a bar or sauntering down the street. I know now, as I did not know when I was a child, that power is on my side, that the police are working for me and not for them. And knowing this, I feel ashamed and guilty, like the good liberal I have grown up to be. Yet the twinges of fear and the resentment they bring and the self-contempt they arouse are not to be gainsaid. I despair of the present push towards integration."
And that's an extraordinary essay. Norman Podhoretz was a friend of James Baldwin. In fact, he had commissioned the essay that becomes a letter from a region in my mind that's published in the New Yorker in November of 1962, that becomes published as the longest essay in The Fire Next Time. They're friends. Baldwin actually approves of that essay because of the honesty of the essay. The essay really reveals liberals' racial fears and nightmares, white liberals, in this case a Jewish American liberal, their fears about racial integration and their fears about losing power, about losing privilege, about losing status, and also their fear of a kind of interracial intimacy. He says in that essay that if his daughter brought home a Negro, and he's only 33 at the time, but in the future, that he would really be upset and really sort of it would be a catastrophe, but he would try to overcome it. He would try to overcome it. So what's so interesting about that essay, Peter, it really shows the way in which there's going to be a liberal reaction that embraces the civil rights movement, but there's going to be a liberal reaction that is repulsed by aspects of the civil rights movement. And it's not just Podhoretz. It's going to be Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who's the assistant labor secretary who publishes the Case for National Action and talks about the black family and the dissolution of the black family in 1965. It's going to be people like Nathan Glazer, who talks about the melting pot and black people are really just the last of the immigrants and we shouldn't have any kind of special treatment for them. So it's going to be very, very interesting when we think about 63. It's a year where ideas matter and you can see that they're being animated into action. And it's ideas that are pro-civil rights, but there are also ideas that are anti-civil rights, and then there are ideas somewhere in the middle that say, well, some of this makes sense to me, but some of it doesn't.
And James Baldwin praised Podhoretz's honesty, didn't he?
He did. Lorraine Hansberry did not. And I'd love to juxtapose.
Who is Lorraine Hansberry?
Lorraine Hansberry is the brilliant black international feminist and writer and author of A Raisin in the Sun, the first play by a black woman to ever become a Broadway hit in 1959. Starring Sidney Poitier, the very, very famous black movie star, and Ruby Dee, and that becomes a film in 1961. But she's an activist, she's a writer, she's an essayist. She tragically dies of pancreatic cancer at 35 in 1965. But people like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Baldwin are huge, huge fans, and Baldwin is a close friend. And Lorraine Hansberry criticizes the Podhoretz essay, and she feels that it's really belittling the black freedom struggle. And it's a misunderstanding on Podhoretz's part of what do African Americans want. They don't want to marry his daughter. They want equal citizenship and equal access and to be treated with respect and dignity by institutions in the United States. Jimmy Baldwin is a different story. Jimmy Baldwin loves to debate and to argue with people who are friends, but even friendly enemies like Norman Mailer. Norman Mailer has a scene in the book where he's calling Jimmy Baldwin black and ugly and a pipsqueak. And Baldwin says, well, I am those things. I just laugh it off when he says that. So it's really interesting in terms of the muscular give and play that happens in 1963.
And it was in 1963 that Baldwin's book, The Fire Next Time, was published. What was its impact?
I think that The Fire Next Time is the most impactful book ever to be published in American history in terms of race relations. In 1963, January 31st, that book becomes not only a bestseller, but it becomes a totem and a touchstone. William F. Buckley reads it. Bobby Kennedy reads it. Jack Kennedy reads it. Baldwin is being interviewed in Mademoiselle magazine. By the next year, it's going to be Vogue, and Gloria Steinem is interviewing him. So he becomes, it's really, we understate Baldwin's ubiquity and importance in 1963. He becomes the single most important living writer in the United States of America and on the planet that year.
And in Freedom Season, you take us on his book tour quite a bit.
He's on a book tour, and he's also on a tour for the Congress of Racial Equality. So he's a public intellectual who calls himself a witness. And it's a very, very interesting, extraordinary transformation. Baldwin grows up in Harlem, born in 1924, one of 9 children, black, queer, a genius who goes to school with Richard Avedon, the photographer, and who becomes good friends with him. who flees to Paris in 1948 because the United States doesn't recognize a black male queer genius in 1948. So he uses Paris as a finishing school. Friends or friendly enemies with Richard Wright and a whole series of expatriates in Paris, and really uses that time to hone his critical skills as the best essayist, I think, ever, and as one of the best novelists of his generation.
Richard Wright, native son?
Richard Wright, native son.
Why do you say that they were frenemies?
They were frenemies because in certain ways, Baldwin looked upon Wright as an older generation who had used social realism in Native Son and Black Boy and Uncle Tom's Children in a way that had run out of gas. Baldwin wanted to be a radical individual, at times in the Ellisonian, Ralph Ellison, Invisible Man, in the Ellisonian Cold War mode. And what that meant was that you were a writer who happened to be black or happened to be Negro rather than a Negro writer. So that was the tension with Richard Wright.
And in Freedom Season, you write that Baldwin's writing, as both inspiration and provocation, stood at the nexus of America's political, literary, and intellectual crossroads that wrestled over questions of race, democracy, citizenship, dignity, and whether color blindness might offer a solution or further barriers in the quest to recognize Negroes as human beings. What was the status of Martin Luther King's colorblind philosophy in 1963?
Well, when we think about King in 19...
And is it fair to attribute that to King?
No, so I would say that King was not interested in a colorblind philosophy, even though he does say at the March on Washington very famously, I hope one day my 4 little children will be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. King was pro what he calls reparations. He says, we come here to cash a check that has been stamped insufficient funds, but we refuse to believe that the Bank of American Democracy is bankrupt. So what King was articulating in 1963 was this vision of a beloved community, but King and that vision of a beloved community become much more expansive when we read Letter from Birmingham Jail. Letter from Birmingham Jail should be understood as King's theory of justice, just like we have John Rawls and we have different philosophers throughout the Western world who've come up with theories of justice, and African philosophers in other worlds too, so I don't want to say just the Western world. But King's theory of justice really has a critique of those who will passively allow injustice to occur because they want peace instead of the chaos that sometimes comes with movements for dignity and citizenship. So when we think about King in 1963, he's a reformer who's on his way to becoming a much more radical figure, on his way to becoming a revolutionary in the late 1960s. But 63 is a turning point for King, and we see that turning point in Birmingham even before the March on Washington.
Now, before we get into Birmingham, why did Greenwood, Mississippi become kind of a focal point in the civil rights movement?
Well, Greenwood is the home of one of the homes and the headquarters of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And SNCC is really the most important grassroots civil rights organization of the 1960s. It was a group that was organized by Ella Jo Baker, who's a black feminist and labor organizer, and it was organized in the wake of the sit-in movements that began February 1st, 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina, at a Woolworth's lunch counter where 4 black students from a historically black college, North Carolina A&T, sat in at a whites-only lunch counter to be served. And that sit-in movement really starts over 60,000 protesters in the spring of 1960 are protesting against segregated lunch counters. What's so interesting about SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee attracts a huge number of committed activists, hundreds of committed activists in the South, in the North, in the East, in the West Coast, and some white students as well. They're going to get their biggest numbers of white students Freedom Summer in 1964 when they go into Mississippi. But in 1963, they are already in Mississippi, and their push for voter registration turns Greenwood, Mississippi into a powder keg. Police brutality, People tried to assassinate Bob Moses, who's one of the organizers of SNCC. And the Kennedy administration is at a loss of what to do. And the New York Times and other national newspapers have Greenwood, Mississippi on the front pages of their newspapers in March of 1963. And it seems like that's going to be the city that transforms the movement.
And C-SPAN's Q&A podcast continues in a moment. Peniel Joseph, I'm going to summarize your 390 pages of book and say that the role of white liberals was complicated. Is that fair?
Yes, very complicated, because white liberals, from one perspective, really helped the movement. They provided money and ballast and support, especially in 1963, because as 1963 unfolds, it becomes obvious that the civil rights movement is the biggest national and global story of the year. And that becomes obvious to the Kennedy administration, even though it's later than to others. But there's also going to be white liberals who feel that the movement is moving too fast and that King's movement is too impatient, let alone Malcolm X and Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. They're not even thinking about them. They're thinking about King as being too impatient and as this radical figure. But then there's going to be others, people like the journalist Murray Kempton, who really writes beautiful essays on the movement and America and what America owes to the legacy of enslaved African Americans who did so much to transform the country and to really build what we now know as the United States of America. So the role of white liberals is very, very achingly complicated. And I think Baldwin plays a very, very important role as being a nexus who's willing to listen to white liberals, even those, and maybe especially those who he disagrees with.
Well, it was April 16th, 1963, in response to a newspaper advertisement put out by liberal white clergy that the letter from Birmingham jail came out. Here's author Reginald Dwayne Betts talking about the letter.
He did it as a call for his colleagues and his peers to show up at the front line, recognizing that the front line, one, did not demand violence, two, did not demand an absence of forgiveness, but really just demanded that you be present. And I read that as a child, and I had to think about what I had been present for in my life. And it had mostly been, I was young, but the most significant thing I had done at that time was pull the pistol out on somebody. And I read the essay and understood that in a profound way, because of my violence, but also because of my humanity, I had to find a way to do something different.
Peniel Joseph, the impact of letter from Birmingham jail.
It's going to be very, very impactful. Now, the publication is going to happen after the Birmingham crisis is over that spring. So in certain ways, it's sort of a delayed impact by the time it's printed, but it's going to be very impactful throughout the year. The American Jewish Congress and different organizations are going to print out tens of thousands of pamphlets. It's an instant classic. And what's so interesting is that it really marks both King's break from white liberals, but it also presents this profound theory of justice where King, in Letter from Birmingham jail, is arguing that the young people who are being arrested in Birmingham are going to one day be remembered and revered as American heroes. But what King does then is take it a step further. He says they're going to be remembered as American heroes, and the quote he uses, for bringing this nation back to those great wells of democracy dug deep by the founding fathers. So what King does in Letter from Birmingham jail is multiple things. He talks about Black humanity as a universal common denominator for American humanity and dignity and citizenship. He criticizes white liberals who don't want to support this search for Black humanity in a muscular and robust way. But he also ties the civil rights movement and the disruption of the civil rights movement to the American Revolution and the founders of the nation. He does this all in this brilliant essay, which I think is in certain ways, the most powerful thing he ever wrote. And it's going to have a huge, huge impact on the road to the March on Washington, because so many Catholic, Jewish, Muslim interdenominational faith leaders read Letter from Birmingham Jail, and in many ways it's their first access to the movement. It's their first access to King's mind and his way of thinking, and they embrace it and they're all in, and that is going to be hugely powerful, including the labor movement when we think about people like Walter Reuther and of course A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin.
Does the original of Letter from Birmingham Jail exist? The pieces of paper, the wrappers that he wrote it on, because he did not write it on a pad of paper like
he didn't.
this.
I don't think we have the amalgamated different pieces of paper that then is snuck to Wyatt Walker, the executive director of the SCLC, and Wyatt Walker is dictating it to one of the SCLC secretaries, and that's what becomes Letter from Birmingham Jail.
Next door in Jackson, Mississippi, Medgar Evers. Yep. Who was he?
Medgar Evers is one of the most important activists of the 1960s. Same age as Malcolm X, born in 1925, a Mississippi native, former football player, married to Merle Evers. He's the field secretary of the NAACP, one of the civil rights activists who publicized the lynching of Emmett Till in 1955. Really, handsome, eloquent, well-spoken, militant, nerves of steel. And he's really one of the most upstanding figures. Being around Medgar Evers gave you courage. That's who Medgar Evers was. In some of the worst parts of Mississippi, he lives in Jackson, but he goes and drives to the Mississippi Delta, many times by himself, only with a shotgun in the trunk of the car in case something happens. A military veteran, served in World War II and Korea. So he's an extraordinary figure who becomes the leading civil rights activist in Jackson, Mississippi by 1963.
And you write in your book, Freedom Season, that in May, Medgar Evers delivered a speech that's the most important, yet least cited in the annals of the civil rights movement. Let's watch a little bit of it.
Don't shop for anything on Capitol Street. Let's let the merchants down on Capitol Street feel the economic pinch. Let me say this to you. I had one merchant to call me, and he said, I want you to know that I've talked to my national office today, and they want me to tell you that we don't need nigger business. Stores that help to support the White Citizens Council, the council that is dedicated to keeping you and I second-class citizens. So let us not trade at these stores. Let's urge our friends, our relatives, our neighbors, not to trade at these stores. Now, finally, ladies and gentlemen, and this is final, we'll be demonstrating here until freedom comes to Negroes here in Jackson, Mississippi.
Medgar Evers is truly extraordinary. What's so interesting for me about Medgar was writing about Medgar Evers while he's alive. I mean, his assassination is going to become a huge pivotal touchstone for that year. But I wanted us and readers to see what kind of man was this? What kind of organizer was he? What kind of father and husband was he to his three children? And what you see is somebody who's so inspiring, so courageous, and so dedicated to really bringing democracy, multiracial democracy and citizenship and dignity to Mississippi, the Magnolia State, a state that he loved. I wanted to show his love for America. He was a patriot. He was a military veteran, but he really loved the state of Mississippi and loved the United States. What he pushes back against is the racial hatred and the segregation, which for him is antithetical to his beliefs in America and American democracy. So I wanted us to see that. And he receives death threats, he receives all kinds of intimidation, but he never ever buckles.
Why do you say a May speech that he made is the most important in the civil rights movement?
Well, in that speech, he gets equal time because the Mayor Thompson had given a speech saying, the white mayor, Mayor Thompson, had given a speech saying that Negroes were treated fine in Mississippi, which was untrue. The police loved Negroes in Mississippi, which was untrue. And everything was fine. It was hunky-dory. What Medgar Evers does is demand equal time, and miraculously, he's given equal time. And he gives a speech where he says he's from Mississippi, he loves Mississippi. He says the NAACP are not subversives. They are Americans, they are patriots. And in that speech, he talks about the black freedom struggle that is emerging throughout the United States. He talks about the African liberation movements and the anti-colonial struggles and how they are a part of this emerging civil rights struggle. And he also says that he fought overseas against Hitlerism and fascism in that speech, and he wants freedom at home. So it's an extraordinary speech, because we don't think about Medgar Evers as a public intellectual. We don't think of him as a scholar, but we can see he's wonderfully intelligent, he's beautifully well-spoken, he's somebody who's both an athlete, a scholar, and he's somebody who's a patriot. And I wanted to show the way in which he's able to articulate this, but for too often, scholars have not cited that speech. Not enough of us have cited that speech. And I wanted us to recover that speech and really recover Medgar Evers as a living legacy, not somebody who's just a martyr, but somebody who really gave us an expansive view of who we could be. And that's where his friendship with James Baldwin is very, very important. There's a great picture of Baldwin and Medgar Evers both reading a paper in Mississippi in early 1963. And Baldwin says that being around Medgar Evers gave him courage for the struggle.
This is your 8th book. What's your day job?
My day job is being a professor of history and public affairs at the University of Texas at Austin.
What's your connection to the LBJ School, and what's its connection to UT?
The LBJ School is the School of Public Affairs named in honor of President Lyndon Baines Johnson, who's one of the characters in this book. And I'm the Barbara Jordan Chair in Political Values and Ethics there. And Barbara Jordan was the congresswoman from Texas and state representative from Texas, huge voting rights activist and one of the iconic figures of the civil rights movement.
How often are you in the classroom?
I'm in the classroom. Well, I'm on leave. I'm about to be on leave, but I'm usually in the classroom every semester. Yes, teaching.
What's your process? This is, again, your 8th book. You're not that old.
You know, my process is really, this book was in my mind for a long time. I did a op-ed for the New York Times called Kennedy's Finest Moment, which is one of the chapters in the book, in 2013. And I've been wanting to do a book on 1963 for years, but my process is an orderly process where whatever is up next, that's what I'm focused on. And the thing I want to do has to wait. And so there were a few other books that were in the queue. And once they were finished and published, I really dived into 63.
Well, you have pages of footnotes in this book. How long did the research take?
Wow, the research on and off for this book was maybe 7 years of research to do this book, because I had to put this book down to do Third Reconstruction, which was my last book. And that was a book that was really urgent in the context of George Floyd and the political reckonings of 2020 and what's happened since.
June 11th, 1963. President Kennedy, in a sense, finds his voice. How did that come about?
Well, I think that the 3 best days of the Kennedy presidency for me domestically are June 9th, 10th, and 11th of 1963. And I think that's because the president finally connects his idealism. Sometimes we think about Kennedy as a realist, as a pragmatist. I think of him as also, in addition to those things, an idealist. He believes in this grand American republic, and he finally walks the talk when it comes to racial justice. And it was a long evolution, not just in 1963, but even as a senator, as a presidential candidate, as president, slow rolling executive orders that he had promised, not doing the kind of political speech that that Martin Luther King Jr., that James Baldwin, that others had asked him to do. And then finally, on June 9th, 10th, and 11th, one in Honolulu, he does an extraordinary speech at a conference of mayors on June 9th. June 10th, right here in Washington, D.C., the American University speech, which is a speech about human rights, ending nuclear proliferation. And really, by the way, the first time an American president uses the term diversity in a specific way. He says that even if we can't get along ideologically with the Soviet Union, we can make the world safe for diversity. That's what President Kennedy says. He says this is a very small planet, and what we have in common is that we all love our children and we're all mortal. And I connect that speech on human rights to then the June 11th speech, where at 8 p.m. he goes on television and for the first time says that civil rights is a moral issue. He says that he says a revolution is happening in the United States. He says that those who do nothing invite shame as well as violence. Those who act boldly recognize right as well as reality. And one of my favorite lines from that speech, Peter, is where he says that we preach freedom around the world. And then he pauses and he says, and we mean it. This is extraordinary. He says, and we mean it, because he knows that what is happening in 1963 is a time of testing for the nation's values and principles and its moral and ethical framework. And I believe that Kennedy believed in American democracy and believed in equality for all people. So he lives up to that those 3 days. So those are the best 3 days of the presidency. I call it Kennedy's finest moment because I firmly believe it is his finest moment as president domestically. Globally, it's going to be the Bonn and Berlin speeches that same month. Ich bin ein Berliner. But domestically, he is never as true to himself and his values during his presidency as those 3 days.
Where did the Evers family in Jackson, Mississippi watch that speech?
They watched that speech from the Evers family home. Murley was at home. Medgar
with the 4 children.
With the 3 children.
3 children.
3 children. Medgar was on the road. He was at Masonic Temple organizing, but Murley let the children stay up, right? There's Daryl Kenyatta, Rena Denise, and Jack, who's the smallest one. And so when we think about the Evers family, it's a beautiful moment watching that speech. Medgar Evers watches the speech and is very, very excited. He comes home at past 1 a.m. In the morning, and he steps out of his car. There's a carport, and he's instantly shot in the chest and through the heart. And his wife and children come out and find him mortally wounded, but he is alive. He is alive. And they're there for what becomes the last moments of his life. He's going to be taken to a hospital, and he's going to die in the hospital. And that's just a few hours after Kennedy's civil rights address.
What was the reaction of Jack and Bobby Kennedy to that assassination?
The reaction is going to be really one of real fear and surprise and anxiety over what does this mean for the country? Like, what's going to happen next? Just when they think that through the president's speech, which was very, very well received, Martin Luther King Jr. and others are really in tears listening to that speech. It's important to say that's the best speech by a president on matters of racial justice and civil rights since Abraham Lincoln. So there's a century gap when we think about American history. And that's why the Kennedy speech is so important. And that speech in those 3 days serves as a monument to his civil rights legacy. But the Evers assassination is going to be global in scope. It's going to be catastrophic. Somebody like Malcolm X is going to say, what did we expect? Because we're not doing enough to solve the violence and the hatred that's being spread throughout the country. Someone like Dr. King is going to be trying to utilize this crisis as a moment of opportunity to pass the civil rights bill that Kennedy says he's going to introduce that June 11th speech. And
you write in Freedom Season that Roy Wilkins of the NAACP tried to fundraise off this assassination.
He does try to fundraise off the assassination very successfully, but what's so interesting with Roy Wilkins, Executive Secretary of the NAACP, a consummate insider. This is one of the most important activists of the 20th century, and somebody who knows how to talk to presidents, how to talk to vice presidents, how to talk to corporate leaders. And Roy Wilkins is very, very leery of Martin Luther King Jr. and his fame and his celebrity, and King trying to encroach on his territory as head of the NAACP. So Roy Wilkins does not allow King to speak at Medgar Evers' funeral, and he does not allow King to fundraise off of Medgar Evers' funeral, because King initially wants to do a new scholarship for Medgar Evers and in his name. King is not thinking of it in a competitive way. Dr. King was not that kind of political strategist. His brilliance and his genius for organizing is about bringing people together, producing coalitions and consensus. It's not about the hardball insider politics of turf wars and protecting yourself. Roy Wilkins, exact opposite. Roy Wilkins isn't this glorious, eloquent public speaker, but he is somebody who's so adroit and adept at the turf wars that are a part of the civil rights movement.
And C-SPAN's Q&A podcast continues in a moment. Peniel Joseph, before we get too far away, I want to go back to May 24th. May 24th, in a chapter you call The Summit. This is something I had no idea about.
The Summit, this is Bobby Kennedy and James Baldwin's meeting. And this is an extraordinary chapter in American history, the likes of which we have never seen before, and I don't know if we'll ever see again, where Bobby Kennedy asked James Baldwin to organize a meeting of civil rights activists who are cultural figures, people like Harry Belafonte, people like Lena Horne, Baldwin's friend Lorraine Hansberry. Baldwin also brings a young 25-year-old civil rights activist named Jerome Smith, who's part of the Congress of Racial Equality from Louisiana, to the meeting. Kenneth Clark, the black psychologist, who very famous for the doll test in the Brown v. Board 1954 Supreme Court decision, where Kenneth Clark and his wife Mamie Clark showed that black children wanted the white dolls over the black dolls. And that was cited by Earl Warren in the Brown decision 9-0 of why school segregation should be unconstitutional and declared illegal. They're all at this meeting at Joseph P. Kennedy's penthouse apartment in New York City. And Bobby Kennedy comes to the meeting with Burke Marshall. And Bobby Kennedy wanted that meeting organized because he was concerned about racial politics in the North, in northern cities ready to explode, not just the South, but in the North. And he wanted the unvarnished opinion of some experts outside his chain of command. And what he gets really instead is a kind of unvarnished opinion, but a real critique of what the Kennedy administration has done. He is expecting, and it happens, he listens to it for 3 hours, shirt sleeves rolled up, him and Harry Belafonte initially chatting about Ethel's latest pregnancy. He has 7 children by this time. And what's so extraordinary is that these activists, led by Baldwin, but certainly Jerome Smith, tell him that the administration is not doing enough, that they are dissatisfied, that the administration is not recognizing black humanity and citizenship to the degree that the crisis demands. And he's really gobsmacked. He's taken aback.
Is he defensive?
He's super defensive, and no group of black people, at least, have ever spoken to him this way. So part of it, there is a racial etiquette that happens where Bobby Kennedy is cracked open and remade through this meeting.
June 19th, 5,500 word civil rights. How do you describe what JFK sent to Congress?
Well, it's extraordinary. It's the Civil Rights Act of 1963. And that Civil Rights Act is going to become eventually the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that is passed under Lyndon Baines Johnson.
And again, 1 week after Medgar Evers'
his assassination, it's brought up to Congress. And when we think about the Civil Rights Act of 1963, what does it do? It ends public discrimination in restaurants, in federal buildings, in hotels. It provides a gateway to what is going to become the Voting Rights Act. It provides new protections and expanded notions of citizenship, really for the first time in a century since the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Really, really, really important measure. Kennedy is not sure if it's going to be able to be passed, but it's what civil rights activists and the movement have been demanding since 1961.
Could that Civil Rights Act of 1964 pass without Republican support?
No, it could not have been passed without Republican support.
What was the role of Everett Dirksen?
Everett Dirksen is going to be the Republican leader who really Senate leader who really he's an ally of the Kennedys, and he's going to be integral to passing what becomes the 1964 Civil Rights Act under Lyndon Baines Johnson.
June 22nd, JFK and MLK meet at the White House. Why were they meeting, and what transpired?
Well, there's two meetings. So JFK has a private meeting at the Rose Garden with Martin Luther King Jr., and then there is a larger meeting with civil rights activists like Roy Wilkins where they discuss the March on Washington. Kennedy meets with King to give him a warning, to warn him that there's really a dual warning, warning him that, one, the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover is investigating him and looking at him, and that there are communists who are on his staff, particularly Stanley Levison, who was one of his best friends, white, Jewish, former CP, but really no longer part of the CP, maybe had still given them a little bit of money, but one of King's main advisors, and also Jack Odell, Hunter Pitts Odell, nicknamed Jack, who was one of King's key lieutenants in SCLC. Jack Kennedy tells him, both of these are communists, you've got to kick them out. You've got to kick them out. King, what's so interesting is that King, who's usually not confrontational, really holds his ground and says, well, I need proof. I need proof that they're communists before I can kick them out, because I think these are real upstanding people who are helping me and advising me. And Kennedy warns him, and this is right around the time that the Profumo scandal has happened in England, which took down the prime minister. And Kennedy warns him that you can't be so close to these folks that they'll take your movement down, because he says if your enemies shoot you down, they shoot us down too. So what's so interesting about Kennedy, by June 22nd, he sees that him, Bobby Kennedy, the future of his administration, Martin Luther King Jr., they're all wrapped up together. And he also tells Dr. King implicitly that the FBI is an enemy. J. Edgar Hoover is an enemy. J. Edgar Hoover is trying to sink you, but Hoover also doesn't have much love for the Kennedys as well.
The Profumo scandal in England, that was a sexual scandal, wasn't it?
That was a sexual scandal.
And why would JFK and RFK, who run the country and the Judiciary Department, not put a stop to Hoover's surveillance?
Well, Hoover had evidence that Jack Kennedy, as a young man, had been involved with a woman who had been a spy for the Germans, and so Inga Arvad. And so they had also evidence of Jack Kennedy's promiscuous sexual relationships, extramarital relationships while serving as president of the United States. So they implicitly had evidence on Kennedy. Kennedy, of course, could technically fire the FBI director, but the director could leak all that information to enemies of the Kennedys, and that would be a scandal that was too much for the Attorney General or the President to handle.
So it's safe to say that the Kennedys were scared of Hoover?
Absolutely. The Kennedys were scared of Hoover, and many, many different presidents and people in Washington at that time were.
Peniel Joseph, in 1963, how surveilled were the leaders of the civil rights movements?
They were very surveilled. We talk about the summit. In the aftermath of the summit, Attorney General Bobby Kennedy has the FBI look into and wiretap Clarence Jones, who's King's attorney. And that wiretap is going to lead to Hoover finding out about King's extramarital relations. Before that, he had no clue. And Baldwin's FBI file is going to grow because of the summit. And so when we think about Malcolm X, certainly Martin Luther King Jr. is the most surveilled. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The FBI looks upon civil rights activists as anti-American subversives, and dupes for the Communist Party, even though they are not. So it's an extraordinary juxtaposition where the very people who are trying to, what the SCLC says, redeem the soul of America, save America's soul, are looked upon by the FBI as public enemy number one.
And before we run out of time, you write about James Baldwin throughout your book and throughout 1963. Let's hear a little of him speaking.
There's been in this country for a dangerously long time two levels of experience. One, to put it cruelly, but I think quite truthfully, can be summed up in the image of Doris Day and Gary Cooper. I think you know what they do. And the other, subterranean, indispensable, but denied, which can be summed up, let us say, in the tone of Ray Charles. And there's never been in this country any real confrontation between these two realities.
What do you hear?
Baldwin is brilliant. Baldwin's a genius. When you think about the end of the fire next time, he says that we can finally end the racial nightmare and achieve our country. Baldwin's interested in an aspirational, multiracial democracy where blacks and whites and everyone in between recognize the inherent humanity in each other. He says the bridge to that, the crucible, is confronting the original sin of racial slavery, but also the myths and the lies that we've utilized to rationalize the current racial problems in the country. So Baldwin is this truly extraordinary figure. After the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, September 15th, 1963, Baldwin becomes this prophetic figure. I.F. Stone says he preaches with the fire of a Hebrew prophet. Izzy Stone, I.F. Stone's journal, one of the great journalists of the period. So when we think about Baldwin, Baldwin is somebody who's constantly evolving. And by the end of 1963, he's still a believer, but he's less hopeful than he was at the start of 1963.
And of course, on August 28th, 1963, the March on Washington, 250,000 people come to Washington. I Have a Dream speech.
And the March on Washington, when you think about Baldwin's role, he was supposed to speak, but they don't let him speak because they're afraid of what he might say. And so Burt Lancaster really says what he was supposed to say. And what's interesting is he organizes the celebrity contingent. He had organized a Paris March on Washington, August 24th, and he organizes the celebrity contingent, which includes Paul Newman, Charlton Heston, all these different celebrities. And what's interesting is journalists ask him how he feels after the march. And he's so excited. He's so hopeful about the day. He says that it's indescribable, and he would have to either cry or sing to explain to them how he feels. So the march is a huge high point for that year of 1963. And by the way, Malcolm X attends the March on Washington. Fierce critic, calls it the farce on Washington, but it shows us the power of that movement and wanting to belong, that he attends the March on Washington.
3 weeks later, back to Birmingham. Carol Robertson, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Denise McNair. Who were they?
These are 4 children who are attending church at the 16th Street Baptist Church, which is the headquarters, right across the street from the headquarters of the Birmingham movement from the spring. And they're attending Sunday school, and the white supremacists and racial terrorists plant a bomb that kill all 4 girls. Others are injured, and 2 more children are killed that day. Johnny Robinson is killed by a police officer, and Virgil Peanut Ware is shot by a white teenager who just wanted to see what would happen. So 6 children in one day are killed. And this is where we see history doesn't run in a straight line. So as good as the Kennedys have been that spring, when that happens in autumn, President Kennedy doesn't come to the funerals. Bobby Kennedy doesn't come to the funerals. Martin Luther King Jr.
Was that a political decision?
Those are political decisions. Those are political decisions because they don't want to be seen as inflaming the passions that are there. And so they stay in the White House, and they have two Southern football coaches who had Earl Blake and another person who had been football coaches and military men go down there as their emissaries because they still want to keep the South viable for the 1964 presidential election. And so for somebody like Jimmy Baldwin, those deaths really break something in him. King preaches 3 of the 4 funerals, but Baldwin organizes alongside of Bayard Rustin, who's the black, queer, brilliant organizing genius who organizes the March on Washington, and the practical effects of having the bathrooms there, having the water fountains there, the logistical, he does that. Really one of the organizing feats of the 20th century. Bayard Rustin and Baldwin organized demonstrations all across the country in support and remembrance of the 6 children who were killed in Birmingham.
In your book, at least 5 times, you print all of their names in full.
All of their names in full, because I think it's really important for us to humanize them and to say these were young people who had bright futures. Even amidst the politics of racial segregation, they had bright futures that were really snuffed out through no fault of their own. So I wanted to show and say this isn't just children, they're not anonymous, because the more, as we know, we personalize things, the more we feel it. Right? So even writing this book, I felt their deaths, and I still feel their deaths. And I think it's part of the tragedy of the time, especially juxtaposed against the triumph of the March on Washington.
Did you do that on purpose, write their names again and again and again throughout?
Yes, absolutely. I wanted us to feel their loss the same way that Baldwin and others feel their loss. And we can see the passion and the anger that Baldwin has in the wake of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. But Baldwin also remembers the 2 boys who are killed. So he's constantly saying 6 children have been killed. And by the end of the year at Howard University, Baldwin says that the martyrs of this period are those 6 children, Medgar Evers, but also President Kennedy after his assassination.
Martin Luther King was not invited to Jack Kennedy's funeral mass and stood outside, you write.
Yes, I mean, and this is something that hurts Dr. King personally. He really feels that was a huge oversight, and he takes it personally. He has admiration and love for Jack Kennedy and felt that him and Kennedy were counterparts in their respective communities. So it's really something that he was not personally invited.
Let's review very quickly 1963 events. January 1st was the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. April 16th, a letter from Birmingham jail came out and was published. In May, James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time was published. June 11th, JFK did a national address on civil rights. Very shortly after, on June 12th, Medgar Evers was assassinated in Jackson, Mississippi. June 19th, the Civil Rights Bill was sent to Congress. On June 27th, there was a Detroit Walk to Freedom with Martin Luther King.
June 23rd.
June 23rd,
Yes.
Thank you. August 28th, the March on Washington. Yes. September 15th, the Birmingham 16th Street church bombing. And of course, November 22nd, JFK was assassinated. And on December 1st of 1963, Malcolm X was suspended from the Nation of Islam, something we didn't get to talk about, but your next book.
Yes, the next book is looking at Malcolm's last year. When we think about this December 1st, chickens coming home to roost comment, this is really extraordinary because what Malcolm is saying by saying that Jack Kennedy's death is an example of chickens coming home to roost is about the violence that is reverberating all across the United States and globally, and that it came back on Kennedy. It's taken by newspapers and journalists as Malcolm is gleefully celebrating the president's assassination, and that's going to lead to his ouster from the Nation of Islam.
Peniel Joseph is the author of Freedom Season, How 1963 Transformed America's Civil Rights Revolution. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Peter.
Well, thanks for listening to this week's Q&A podcast produced by C-SPAN. If you like this podcast, tell your friends, rate and review us, And follow us on social media at BookTV for more updates and schedule information. And if you're looking for more of C-SPAN's book programming, follow our Bookshelf podcast feed, your one-stop source for the Afterwards, Book Notes Plus, and Q&A podcasts. Discover compelling conversations with authors, historians, and thought leaders all in one place. Subscribe to C-SPAN's Bookshelf podcast today. Next week, our guest is George Washington law professor Jonathan Turley, talking about the freedom of speech, which he calls the indispensable right.